You'll either do what we say or you'll get out of this house. Daniel's words slammed into me like a fist. I, Evelyn, still waking up each morning to care for my husband as Alzheimer's slowly erased him, stood frozen, grocery bags biting into my palms. My own son, not my only child, but the one I thought would stand by me, stared at me with contempt. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, folded her arms beside him. Lips curled in a smirk that told me she believed she had already won. I had raised 3 children. Each sacrifice, each sleepless night, each hard-earned dollar was meant to build them a future. The others moved far away with families of their own. Daniel stayed. I believed he stayed for me, for his father. Instead, he stayed for the house, for control. For years I endured. I kept silent while spoon-feeding my husband who no longer remembered my name. I swallowed every insult, convincing myself that if I bore it quietly, Daniel's heart might soften. But this moment was different. In his eyes there was no love, only entitlement. I didn't beg. I didn't argue. I smiled, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and walked out. Daniel thought I'd break. Instead, I began. People think hardship arrives with a crash, sirens, pink slips, courtroom doors. In my life, it arrived as a drip, one small sacrifice after another, so constant that I stopped noticing I was bleeding. I raised 3 children, Anna, Caleb, and Daniel. The years blur into a carousel of shifts and schedules, packing lunches at 5 a.m., smoothing fevered foreheads at midnight, rolling coins on the kitchen table to make rent. Back then, my husband, Harvey, was the steady anchor, an electrician with square hands and a laugh that could push back a storm. When the first slips of memory started, lost keys, a burned kettle, a name caught on the tongue, we blamed stress, age, anything but what it was. Alzheimer's doesn't kick the door in. It loosens the hinges quietly. I took the extra hours at the credit union. Just till Christmas, I told the kids. Christmas turned into summer. Summer turned into years. I learned the smell of burnt coffee at 9 p.m., learned to do the math of scarcity by heart, mortgage, utilities, car insurance, groceries, school supplies, the never-ending parade of unexpected. When Anna needed a down payment for her nursing program deposit, I sold my wedding china. When Caleb cracked a molar and the dental bill threatened to swallow us whole, I stitched hems for the ladies at church late into the night. When Daniel crashed his secondhand car and we didn't have enough for the deductible, I pawned my mother's pearl earrings. There's a ledger in my head with columns for every choice, and the number at the bottom is always love. When Harvey's diagnosis became official, I played brave. I memorized medication schedules, taped reminders by the door, turned the hallway into a runway of sticky notes. Turn off stove, call Evelyn. Trash day Tuesday. I learned the language of neurologists and social workers. I learned to tell him the same story the same way every morning, because consistency is a kindness with this disease. We live on Maple Street. We have 3 children. I'm Evelyn. I love you. Some days he answered, I know. Some days he looked at me like I was a receptionist in a lobby he'd never seen. The other 2 kids built lives far away, not out of neglect, out of survival and opportunity. Anna sends photos from Denver, scrub caps with sunflowers, a tiny apartment full of plants and mismatched mugs. Caleb video calls from Austin, his face lit blue by a computer screen, always promising to visit after this sprint at work. They help when they can. Plane tickets on holidays, a surprise Instacart order, a Venmo note that says, for Dad's favorite cookies. I don't resent them. I wanted them to have escape velocity. Daniel stayed. At first, it felt like grace. He picked up Harvey from the day program when my shift ran late. He mowed the lawn on Sundays. He held the ladder when I cleaned the gutters and told me to quit trying to do everything yourself, Ma. When he brought Rachel around, pretty, practical shoes, a careful smile, I thought maybe our house would fill with new laughter, new hope. I cooked big meals and slid the best pieces of chicken to their plates. I told myself we were a family restitching itself. But staying and helping are not the same thing. It was small at first. Daniel borrowed my debit card for gas, then forgot to return it. He asked if he and Rachel could keep a spare key to the lockbox in case of emergencies, and somehow that became the only key they used. He started calling my bedroom the back room, as if language could redraw property lines. When I was too tired to cook, he asked if I could at least do the dishes, since Rachel had a long day. When Harvey wandered outside once and the neighbor brought him back, it was, "Why didn't you keep a better eye on Dad?" Never, "Thank you for catching him." Entitlement arrives like mold, quietly, in corners you don't inspect, because you trust the walls. Money became fog. The utility bill came addressed to me, but Daniel insisted he'd paid his share in cash. The grocery receipt showed steaks I didn't buy and beer I didn't drink. Small withdrawals peppered my bank statement at odd hours, 20 here, 40 there, always explained as, "I'll put it back Friday." Friday never arrived. When I questioned it, he laughed and said, "It's all the same household, Ma." Household is a useful word when you want to spend someone else's money. I told myself he was stressed. Jobs were thin. Rachel's hours fluctuated. Young couples have it hard. I kept repeating that while I spoon-fed Harvey oatmeal and reminded him to swallow. I repeated it while my feet swelled and ached, and I rubbed them with menthol cream in the dark. I repeated it while Rachel critiqued how I folded laundry. "If you do it this way, it fits better in our drawers." Hour. That word became a knife I kept pretending wasn't sharp. There were good moments. It's important to say that, because people like me cling to them like rafts. An evening when Daniel fixed the leaky faucet without being asked. A day when Rachel brought home a discounted bouquet and left it on the kitchen table for brightness. The afternoon Harvey recognized me, really recognized me, and said Evie, the name he used only when we were young and reckless. I cried in the pantry so no one would see, then came out and served dinner to the people who lived in my house. The breaking wasn't one event so much as a stack of straws. The night Harvey wandered at 3 a.m. and I found him barefoot in the yard, shivering, and Daniel slept through my banging on his door. The morning my check to the pharmacy bounced because someone had stopped the auto pay I set years ago. The afternoon Rachel told me, without a flinch, to keep the TV down in the living room because she needed quiet for a TikTok video. The week I realized the only place that had my name without negotiation was the label on Harvey's pill organizer. Somewhere in there, I started keeping receipts in a manila folder. Not because I had a plan, because I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. Bank statements, the property deed, a list of medications and copays, a log of who said what and when. I wrote it all down in tight, tidy script the way I used to balance books at the credit union. Numbers don't lie. Patterns don't lie. People do. If you want to know the hardest part, it's not the work. Work I can do. It's the silence between what I gave and what came back. I poured years into a son who learned the shape of my generosity and mistook it for an ATM. I gave a home and was told to be grateful for a corner in it. I care for a husband who forgets me every hour, and a son who remembers only what benefits him. So when Daniel stood in our living room and told me to obey or leave, it wasn't an explosion, it was a verdict. The ledger I'd kept in my head finally balanced, the columns of sacrifice and contempt lining up cleanly under the fluorescent light of truth. I didn't pack anger into that suitcase. I packed evidence. I packed boundaries. I packed the part of me that still believed enduring was the same as loving. Walking out wasn't the hardest thing I've done. Staying had been. The first night at the Pine Lodge Motel, I sat on the edge of a narrow bed and listened to the buzz of a flickering neon sign outside. It smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. To anyone else, it would have felt cheap, temporary, maybe even humiliating. But to me, it felt like breathing again. After years of swallowing my dignity in silence, the stale air of that motel room tasted like freedom. I opened my laptop on the rickety desk and began my own kind of reckoning. The bank statements, the canceled checks, the piles of receipts I had tucked away like a squirrel hoarding acorns, they all told a story. My story. For 5 years, my Social Security checks, my savings, even the last fragments of Harvey's pension had been funneled into keeping Daniel and Rachel afloat. Their mortgage, their utilities, their endless appetite for extras. And I had told myself it was family. That family meant giving until it hurt. That night, I stopped the automatic transfers. One phone call, one confirmation number, and their stability began to wobble. By the next morning, I'd canceled the car insurance that covered both their vehicles. Within days, their credit card privileges disappeared. For years, they had believed my generosity was bottomless. Now they would see what it was like to stand on their own. Strangely, it wasn't vengeance that guided me. It was clarity. I realized, sitting in that motel room with my folder of documents, that I had enabled their weakness. My love had turned into a cushion they stomped on, and my silence had been mistaken for permission. Cutting them off wasn't cruelty, it was justice. For myself, and maybe, in some twisted way, for them too. The call started almost immediately. At first, Daniel's voice was casual. "Mom, the mortgage payment didn't go through. Must be some kind of banking error." I deleted the voicemail, then Rachel. "Evelyn, could you please sort this out? The insurance company is calling Jason's work." Delete. By the end of the week, the tone had shifted. Panic in Melissa's voice, rage in Daniel's. I listened only long enough to hear their fear deepen, then pressed delete again. Meanwhile, I built a new routine. Every morning, I walked Harvey to the day program 2 blocks away, his hand trembling but still warm in mine. Every evening, I picked him up, and we ate simple dinners together in that tiny motel kitchenette. He didn't always remember who I was, but sometimes, when the light caught him right, he smiled at me like the man I had married 50 years ago. Those small glimmers were enough. They reminded me why I was still standing. The strangest part was how quickly the community shifted. Kalispell is a small town. Whispers travel faster than the mail. By the second week, people I'd known for decades stopped me in the diner, at the pharmacy, at church. "Evelyn, we heard what Daniel said to you. We can't believe it. You didn't deserve that." Pity mixed with admiration in their eyes. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. And then came the allies. Bob Harrison, my old colleague from the credit union, told me Daniel had tried to forge papers for a home equity loan months earlier. Detective Morrison confirmed the gambling debts at Glacier Peaks Casino. Piece by piece, the truth surfaced, and every piece went into my growing evidence folder. What had once been private shame was turning into undeniable fact. I found myself no longer hunched, no longer whispering apologies for taking up space. Each confirmation number, each document, each sympathetic nod in town lifted me straighter. I was no longer just a tired wife of a fading man, or a mother reduced to her son's servant. I was Evelyn Carter, a woman who had spent decades serving others and had finally decided to serve herself. Sitting in that motel room one quiet night, I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me. Harvey dozed peacefully in the next bed. His breathing steady. For the first time in years, there was no shouting, no demands, no footsteps stomping through my home, just peace. And in that stillness, I understood. I hadn't lost a home. I had gained back my life. The knock came on a Thursday morning, sharp and unrelenting, rattling the flimsy motel door like it had something to prove. I already knew who it was before I checked the peephole. Some part of me had been waiting for this moment since the first mortgage payment bounced. Through the glass, I saw Daniel, my son. His face flushed with a mix of anger and desperation. Beside him stood Rachel, her hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. They looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe it was that their confidence had finally been stripped away. I opened the door, but only halfway. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice strained, "we need to talk." Rachel chimed in quickly, her tone soft, rehearsed. "Please, Evelyn, we need to explain." I let the silence hang. It unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Finally, I stepped aside just enough for them to enter. The room was too small for 3 people, and the tension filled it faster than the air conditioner could hum. Daniel wasted no time. "Why did you do this? Why cut us off? The bank is threatening foreclosure. My insurance lapsed. My credit's shot. And now I might lose my job." "You've ruined everything." I folded my hands in my lap, my voice calm. "I haven't ruined anything, Daniel. I simply stopped paying for lives that weren't mine to carry." Rachel leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Evelyn, we were under so much pressure. Jason's hours were cut. I've been trying to pick up shifts, but it's not enough. You've always been there for us. Why now? Why abandon us when we need you most?" The word abandon almost made me laugh. For 5 years, I had been the net under their every reckless jump. "Abandonment," I said evenly, "is what you did when you told me to obey or leave my own house. You gave me an ultimatum. I made my choice." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. You were supposed to—" He stopped, searching for words, but the truth slipped out anyway. "To stay useful." There it was. Naked, blunt, cruel. I felt the sting, but also the strange relief of hearing aloud what I had known for years. To Daniel, I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a utility. "Useful?" I repeated, my voice sharper now. "I raised you, fed you, paid for your car, your schooling, your wedding. I've paid your mortgage, your groceries, your insurance. I've kept your life floating while mine sank. And still, that wasn't enough." Rachel's eyes darted to Daniel, then back to me. "We said things we didn't mean. You know, stress makes people lash out. Daniel didn't mean it, but I saw it in his eyes. He meant every word." "What about the loan, Daniel?" I asked suddenly. His head snapped up. "The forged papers you took to the bank, claiming my house was yours for collateral. Did you not mean that either?" Color drained from his face. Rachel blinked rapidly, clearly blindsided. "What loan?" she whispered. I pressed on. "Bob Harrison showed me everything. Your signature, your lies, the casino debts. You didn't just insult me. You tried to steal from me." Daniel's mask cracked. His voice rose, almost a shout. I had no choice. You don't understand what it's like owing that kind of money. People are coming after me, Mom. They'll destroy us." "And so you thought you'd destroy me first?" I asked. Rachel's voice trembled now, genuine fear creeping in. "Daniel, is this true? The casino, the debts." His silence was answer enough. He turned on me instead, his tone pleading now. "Please, Mom, I'm your son. You can't just watch me go under. I'll change, I promise. Just help us this once." "This once?" I said, my voice low. "I've been helping you this once for 5 years." The room felt heavier than my chest could bear. For a moment, I almost gave in. The instinct to protect, to rescue. The reflex wired into every mother's bones. But then I thought of Harvey, sitting in his day program, confused and fragile. I thought of Anna and Caleb, working miles away, never asking me for a dime, only sending support when they could. I thought of every insult. Every order barked at me in the house I had built with my own hands. "No," I said finally. Rachel burst into tears. Daniel cursed under his breath, pacing the small carpet like a caged animal. Finally, he stopped, his shoulders slumping. "So that's it? You're just going to watch your own son drown?" I stood, my back straight, my voice steady. "I am watching my son face the consequences of his choices. There's a difference." For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Rachel grabbed Daniel's arm. "We should go," she whispered. He resisted, then allowed her to pull him toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back, eyes blazing. "This isn't over, Mom. You'll regret this." I didn't flinch. "No, Daniel. For the first time, I won't." The door closed behind them with a hollow thud, but inside me, something solidified. The woman they thought they could bully had vanished. What remained was someone they'd never met before, a mother who had stopped confusing sacrifice with surrender. The phone rang within an hour, another creditor, another voice looking for Daniel. I gave them the truth. No son of mine owned that house, and he no longer lived at my address. Every call, every conversation, every piece of evidence added bricks to the wall I was building, not out of spite, but out of survival. They had tried to make me break. Instead, they had forced me to rise. When the motel door closed on Daniel and Rachel, I sat back down on the bed, my hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of finality. This was no longer about a family argument that would blow over in a few days. Something deeper had broken, and there was no stitching it back together with apologies or half-hearted promises. For the first time in years, I knew I had to move beyond words and test every story they had spun, every excuse they had offered, until the truth stood naked. The first test was silence. I didn't return calls. I didn't answer texts. I didn't rush to solve the emergencies they dangled in front of me like bait. I let the storm fall on their shoulders instead of mine. Within days, the messages multiplied, Daniel's voice shifting from anger to pleading in the space of a single voicemail. "Mom, the bank is threatening foreclosure. You have to fix this." Then softer. "You raised me better than this. Don't let me fall." By the end of the week, Rachel had joined him. "Evelyn, think about Harvey. He wouldn't want the family torn apart like this." Harvey, my husband, the man they barely acknowledged as he slipped further into Alzheimer's, suddenly invoked as their leverage. I deleted the messages without hesitation, but silence alone was not enough. I needed evidence. On Monday, I walked into First National Bank with my folder of receipts and statements tucked under my arm. Bob Harrison greeted me like the old colleague I was, his face tightening as he looked through the paperwork. When I asked if Daniel had ever tried anything with my accounts, Bob hesitated before sliding a file across the desk. There, in black ink, was Daniel's forged attempt at a home equity loan, his handwriting clumsy over my signature, claiming my house as collateral. The application had been rejected only because Bob caught the discrepancy. "He's in deep," Bob said quietly. "Casinos, short-term lenders. He's running out of options." I left with copies of the documents, my evidence folder a little heavier, my resolve a little sharper. That afternoon, I took the folder to the courthouse and filed for an eviction notice. The clerk looked at me carefully when I explained it was my son and his wife who were living there. I slid the deed across the counter, my voice steady as I said, "It's my property. Their occupancy was conditional on respect and contribution. Both have been violated." She stamped the papers, and just like that, the law itself became part of my arsenal. At the police station, Detective Jim Morrison listened as I laid out Daniel's threats, the forgery, the debts. He shook his head grimly. "Evelyn, this isn't just family trouble anymore. Those debts, some belong to people who don't take a person to court. They take them to the alley. Protect yourself. Keep every scrap of evidence." That night in my motel room, I spread the papers across the desk like a battlefield map, bank statements, copies of forged documents, the stamped eviction notice. It no longer looked like family drama. It looked like a case file. By Friday, the manipulation escalated. Daniel's voice on the phone carried a new weapon. "Mom, Rachel's pregnant. You'll have a grandchild soon. Do you really want us homeless now?" For a moment, my heart faltered. A grandchild. The thought was powerful, designed to weaken me, but the timing was too convenient. Rachel had never once mentioned children, and now suddenly, in the middle of financial collapse, she was supposedly carrying the one thing that might break me. I decided to test it. The next morning, I called Dr. Richards's office, the same clinic Harvey had used for years. "I'd like to confirm if Rachel Thompson is a patient here," I asked. The receptionist checked and replied gently, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. There's no record of that name." I hung up slowly and noted it down. Pregnancy story, false. Another thread snapped. The next test wasn't legal or medical, it was social. Kalispell is a small town, and small towns thrive on stories. On Sunday, I walked into St. Mark's Lutheran Church, Harvey at my side, his hand trembling in mine. When testimony time came, I stood. My voice was calm, not angry. For 5 years, I have supported Daniel and Rachel financially. Their home, their groceries, their insurance, all paid from my retirement and Harvey's pension. When I asked for respect, I was told to obey or leave. I chose to leave. Gas spread through the pews. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. In Kalispell, truth travels faster than lies. By evening, half the town knew who had betrayed whom. The following day, Tom from the hardware store pulled me aside. "We've seen Daniel around," he said. "He's been bragging for years that he paid all the bills. Now people know the truth." My evidence wasn't just paper anymore. It was people. When Daniel realized his version of events wasn't sticking, he grew reckless. Late one night, he stormed into the Pine Lodge parking lot, shouting and demanding I come outside. The night manager, Steve, a retired Army sergeant, called the police and later handed me the security footage. With that, I filed for a restraining order. Within 24 hours, it was granted. Daniel Thompson, prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. For the first time in years, the law stood between me and his temper. Meanwhile, the evidence folder grew. Proof of fraudulent loans, copies of bank statements showing withdrawals I never made, confirmation from Dr. Richards disproving the pregnancy lie, the eviction notice, the restraining order, the testimonies of townspeople who had seen how I'd been treated. Every claim Daniel made, I tested. Every story, I checked. Every manipulation, I dismantled piece by piece. And then came the creditors. One voicemail after another, left by unfamiliar voices. This is Marcus Webb from Frontier Financial Services. We're looking for Daniel Thompson regarding a past due account. Another from Continental Recovery. Another from a local lender. Each call proved what I already knew. Daniel hadn't just been leaning on me, he'd been drowning and trying to drag me under with him. As I listened to those messages, I felt something strange. Not sorrow, not even anger. Curiosity. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, each piece falling exactly where I expected. For years I had lived beneath the weight of lies, forced to bend so they wouldn't topple. Now I stood apart and watched gravity take its course. One evening, Harvey dozed in his chair by the window, the motel TV flickering softly. I sat at the desk, folder open, pen in hand, writing down the day's notes. I realized I was no longer recording for my own memory. I was building a case against my own son, yes, but more than that, a case for myself, for the woman who had endured quietly, who had been told to obey or get out, who had chosen dignity over servitude. Daniel thought he could break me. Instead, he had given me the resolve to test him, expose him, and piece by piece, reclaim my life. The days that followed became less about surviving and more about building. Each morning I woke early, brewed the weak motel coffee, and laid out my folder on the small desk by the window. To anyone else, it might have looked like clutter, bank statements, copies of deeds, police reports, handwritten notes. To me, it was structure, proof, armor. For too long I had allowed words, Daniel's words, Rachel's words, to define reality. Now, only paper and evidence would decide the truth. The first major step was property. My home, the one Harvey and I had worked decades to pay off, had always been the battlefield. Daniel's greatest leverage was his assumption that if he lived there long enough, it became his. I knew enough law to suspect that wasn't how ownership worked, but suspicion wasn't enough. I drove to the courthouse and asked for a certified copy of the deed. When the clerk stamped the heavy paper with its raised seal, I felt something shift inside me. That single page, with my name and Harvey's printed clear and uncontested, was stronger than 1,000 of Daniel's ultimatums. I slid it into the folder behind a divider labeled Property. Next came Finances. At the credit union, I requested transaction histories going back 5 years. The printouts were thick, a ledger of my slow bleeding. There it was. Mortgage transfers, utility payments, grocery store charges, and amounts I never spent on myself. There were withdrawals at gas stations at odd hours, always round numbers, 50 here, 100 there. Daniel's fingerprints. The teller, a woman younger than Anna, gave me a sympathetic look as she handed the stack over. "We can flag any further attempts from their cards," she offered gently. I nodded, grateful. At night, I highlighted each suspicious charge and wrote notes in the margins. My accounting skills, long dormant, came alive again. For the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring financial abuse. I was tracing it, mapping it, proving it. Evidence also meant people. After church that Sunday, Mrs. Henderson cornered me with her usual conspiratorial whisper. "Evelyn." I always wondered how they afforded that house. Now it makes sense. She wasn't gossiping this time. She was corroborating. I asked if she'd be willing to put it in writing. Her eyes widened but then softened. Of course, dear. Someone needs to speak the truth. By the end of the week, I had 3 handwritten statements from neighbors and community members who had seen me covering bills, buying groceries, bailing Daniel out of one small disaster after another. Words, once used as weapons against me, were now recorded as evidence in my favor. The creditors became unlikely allies. Each voicemail was another puzzle piece, another proof of Daniel's deception. I began calling them back, not to pay, never again to pay, but to clarify. Daniel Thompson does not own 847 Maple Street. He has no legal claim to it. Please update your records accordingly. Most agents responded with professional detachment, but a few expressed surprise. One admitted, "He listed you as a co-signer on several applications. I requested copies. Within days, I had scans showing my name, forged beneath his. Those pages went into the folder under a new divider marked Fraud. Detective Morrison proved invaluable. I visited his office again, bringing the security footage from Pine Lodge and the restraining order papers. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through the documents slowly. Evelyn, you're building a stronger case than half the prosecutors I work with." He tapped the forged signatures. "This isn't just family betrayal. This is criminal. If he pushes further, we'll have grounds to charge him." For years I had believed I was powerless against Daniel's manipulation. Now the law itself was aligning with me. Harvey's condition added urgency to everything. Each evening, when I collected him from the day program, he looked at me with that bewildered half-recognition. Sometimes he said my name, sometimes he called me by his sisters, sometimes he said nothing at all. But he was mine to protect, and I knew that if Daniel ever regained access to the house, Harvey's safety would be jeopardized. So I added another divider to the folder, medical. I requested letters from Harvey's doctors, confirming his condition and my role as caretaker. If Daniel tried to claim I was incompetent, or that I was mismanaging assets, I would counter with professional testimony. Alzheimer's had taken Harvey's memory, but I would not let it be used as a weapon against me. Bit by bit, the folder grew fat. Property deeds, bank records, community statements, creditor documents, medical letters, police reports, restraining order. Every time I slipped a new page inside, I felt stronger, more untouchable. Evidence was no longer just paper. It was freedom distilled into ink and signatures. Daniel, of course, escalated. When the sheriff served the eviction papers, Rachel called me, sobbing. "We have nowhere to go, Evelyn. How could you do this to your own son?" I wrote down the time of the call, her exact words, and added it to my log. Later that night, Daniel left me a voicemail dripping with venom. "You think you're clever, hiding behind cops and paperwork, but this is still my house. You can't erase me with forms." I saved the recording, labeled it threats. Evidence isn't always on paper. Sometimes it's the sound of entitlement breaking. The more I gathered, the more I realized how many blind spots I had tolerated for years. Receipts I never questioned, credit charges I brushed off, whispered warnings from neighbors I ignored. Now, with clarity as my compass, I saw the pattern. Daniel hadn't become entitled overnight. He had trained me, slowly, to hand over pieces of myself. What I was doing now, documenting, recording, proving, wasn't just preparation for legal battles. It was rewriting the story of my life, page by page, on my own terms. One evening, as Harvey dozed beside me, I flipped through the thickened folder. It no longer felt like a burden, but a shield. For years, Daniel's power had been my silence. With every receipt, every testimony, every official stamp, I was taking that power back. I looked out the motel window at the neon light blinking vacancy and realized something astonishing. I wasn't vacant anymore. I was full of proof, of resolve, of the kind of strength that comes only after you've been emptied completely and survived. When the phone buzzed again, another unknown number, I didn't tense the way I used to. I let it go to voicemail, then listened. Another creditor. Another voice demanding payment from Daniel. This time, instead of dread, I felt calm, because I knew the truth, and I had the papers to prove it. Gathering evidence hadn't just been about building a case against my son, it had been about gathering myself. Every page was a piece of me I had thought was lost, and now, for the first time in years, I was whole again. By the time October winds swept through Kalispell, my evidence folder was as thick as a family Bible. Every forged signature, every receipt, every threatening voicemail, it was all there, stacked in order, a chronicle of betrayal. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Evidence was armor. Retaliation required strategy. I sat at the small motel desk one evening, Harvey sleeping softly in the bed behind me, and asked myself the question I had avoided: what do I want? For years the answer would have been simple: peace. A quiet home, a family that respected me, a son who didn't see me as an endless well. But that dream had died the moment Daniel told me to obey or leave. Now I wanted something sharper. I wanted Daniel exposed, not just to creditors and courts, but to the community he had lied to for years. Retaliation wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth finally standing taller than his lies. The first part of my plan involved the church. In a town like ours, what was spoken on Sunday morning carried more weight than what was printed in Monday's paper. I arranged a meeting with Pastor Williams, a kind man who had baptized all 3 of my children. We sat in his office while Harvey shuffled through hymnals, quietly in the pews outside. I explained everything: the financial exploitation, the threats, the forgery, the casino debts. Pastor listened with eyes that grew heavier with every detail. "Evelyn," he said gently, "sometimes shining light on darkness is the only cure. If you want to speak, the pulpit is yours." The second part of my plan centered on the newspaper. The Kalispell Tribune was modest, but in a small town, modest was enough. I drafted a letter to the editor, not bitter, not dramatic, just factual. The tuition, the mortgage, the groceries, the years of support, and the ultimatum that drove me out of my own home. I wrote with precision, every number double-checked against my receipts. When I finished, I slid the letter into the folder under a divider labeled Public Record. Still, I knew words could be twisted, spun back into accusations of senility or spite, so the third prong of my retaliation would be legal. I met with a lawyer recommended by Bob Harrison. She was young, sharp-eyed, and didn't flinch when I laid the evidence out across her desk. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "your case is airtight. Forgery, fraud, elder financial abuse. If you want charges pressed, the DA will have no trouble moving forward." I hesitated. Pressing charges meant severing the cord completely, leaving no path for reconciliation. But perhaps that cord had already been cut. I was only pretending it still existed. The lawyer also suggested another step I hadn't considered: rewriting my will. If your son believes he has anything to gain by waiting you out, he'll never stop. Remove the incentive. That night, I called the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative, a program that built transitional homes for soldiers returning from service. Within a week, the papers were signed. My house, the very battlefield Daniel had tried to claim, would go not to him, but to families who understood sacrifice. I didn't tell Daniel, not yet. The revelation would come later, when it mattered most. Piece by piece, the plan took shape: church testimony, newspaper letter, legal action, a rewritten will. But the most delicate part was timing. Retaliation only works if the strike is public, undeniable, impossible to spin. Daniel had built his reputation in Kalispell on a foundation of bravado, bragging about paying bills he never paid, pretending to be the man of the house while living off his mother's checks. To dismantle that image, I needed witnesses. I needed him exposed in front of the very people he sought to impress. The opportunity came faster than I expected. Word spread that Daniel had been telling neighbors I was mentally unstable, that I had suffered some kind of breakdown, and that Rachel had stepped in to protect the household. When I heard this, I almost laughed. The desperation was transparent, but in a small town, even lies could take root if not confronted. So I made a decision. I would confront him not in private, but in public, where truth could not be denied. I asked Pastor Williams to reserve time at the next Sunday service for a special announcement. I called the Tribune to confirm the letter would run the following Wednesday. I filed an official request with the courthouse to expedite the eviction hearing, ensuring Daniel would be served notice in the same week. And I spoke quietly with Detective Morrison, who assured me that the restraining order would be enforced if Daniel lashed out. "Be careful, Evelyn," he warned. "Cornered men do desperate things." At night, when Harvey mumbled in his sleep, I sat at the desk rehearsing my words. I didn't want to sound bitter. Bitterness could be dismissed. I wanted to sound like what I was: a woman who had been generous, exploited, and finally done with lies. I practiced the cadence, the pauses, the simple power of truth told plainly. Each time I rehearsed, I imagined Daniel's face when the community heard numbers, not rumors. Dollar amounts, dates, deeds. There is no defense against facts. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It was the waiting. Every time the phone buzzed, every time a car slowed outside the motel, I braced for Daniel's rage. And yet, with every day that passed, I felt stronger. Planning gave me control. For years, Daniel had forced me to live in reaction, reacting to bills, to demands, to insults. Now, for the first time, he was the one reacting, scrambling, while I moved deliberately, step by step, toward a reckoning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, I sat with Harvey by the window. He was lucid for a rare moment, his hand squeezing mine. "Evie," he whispered, using the name only he ever called me, "you're strong." He didn't remember the details, didn't understand the battles, but in that moment, he saw me. That was enough. The next Sunday was approaching, and with it, the moment Daniel would learn that his reign of manipulation was over. My retaliation was ready, not as fire or fury, but as truth sharpened into a blade. He had wanted me to obey or leave. I had left, and now I was coming back, not to beg, but to stand. The church was already full when I arrived that Sunday morning. Kalispell didn't have many places where everyone gathered, but the sanctuary was one of them. The air was heavy with the smell of polished wood and coffee brewed in the fellowship hall. I guided Harvey to a pew near the front, his hand loose in mine, his gaze wandering. People greeted me warmly. "Good morning, Evelyn," but I could feel the undercurrent. They'd heard Daniel's whispers. They'd been told I was losing my mind. Pastor Williams cleared his throat after the final hymn. "Before we close, Mrs. Evelyn Carter has asked to share something important." He gestured toward me, his eyes steady with encouragement. I stood, folder in hand. My knees trembled, but my voice, when it came, was clear. "Many of you know me. You know my husband Harvey. who now struggles with Alzheimer's. You know my son Daniel, and perhaps you've heard his version of our story." A ripple passed through the congregation, subtle but unmistakable. I opened the folder and held up the first page. "This is the deed to 847 Maple Street. My name and Harvey's are on it. No one else's. Not Daniel's. Not Rachel's." I passed copies down the aisle. The papers rustled as they spread through the rows. Next came the bank statements, highlighted and marked. For 5 years, I paid Daniel's mortgage, his groceries, his utilities, thousands of dollars I'll never see again. He told people he was the provider, but these records show the truth. I was. Gas echoed softly. People shifted in their seats, some leaning forward to see the numbers, others glancing at Daniel, who sat stiffly 2 rows back, his jaw clenched. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes darting everywhere but mine. "And this," I continued, holding up a forged loan document, "is my name, written by someone else's hand. Daniel used my house as collateral for debts he never told you about. Debts owed to casinos, debts that nearly cost us everything." The room fell silent, so quiet I could hear Harvey humming faintly beside me, lost in his own world. I let the silence linger before speaking again. I was told to obey or leave my own home. I chose to leave, but I did not leave the truth behind. Today, I bring it here, so there is no confusion, no gossip, no lies left to spread. Daniel finally stood, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control. "She's lying. She's old, confused. Half the time she doesn't even know what day it is." I didn't raise my voice. I simply lifted a letter from Harvey's doctor. "This statement confirms Harvey's condition, not mine. I am his caregiver. I am competent, and I have proof." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his tone firm. "Daniel, sit down." The authority in his voice cut through Daniel's anger. And for the first time, my son looked small, not powerful, not feared, just small. Rachel tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but he jerked away, his face red with fury. I turned back to the congregation. I don't share this to shame my son, though he has shamed himself. I share it because for too long, silence was used as a weapon against me. Silence is what allowed lies to grow. No more silence. I closed the folder with a decisive snap. This community deserves the truth, and Harvey deserves safety. I will not let either be taken from me again. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had given me a written statement, rose to her feet. "I've seen Evelyn pay those bills with my own eyes," she said firmly. One by one, others followed. Nods, murmurs, small gestures of solidarity. Daniel's fury cracked into panic. "You'll regret this, Mom," he spat, his voice shaking. But no one looked at him now. All eyes were on me. Pastor Williams placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you, Evelyn, for your courage." I sat down, Harvey's hand slipping into mine as though by instinct. My chest felt lighter than it had in years. The truth was out. The mask had been torn away, not by rage or revenge, but by simple, undeniable fact. Daniel stormed out, Rachel following in his wake. The heavy doors slammed behind them, but their sound was drowned out by something louder, the quiet hum of a community finally seeing clearly. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one under judgment. I was free. The days following that Sunday felt almost surreal. For years I had walked through Kalispell with my head down, bracing for whispers. Now, when I entered the grocery store or the post office, people greeted me differently, eyes steady, voices warm, shoulders squared in quiet solidarity. It wasn't pity, it was respect. Daniel, on the other hand, could not escape the fallout. Within a week, The Kalispell Tribune ran my letter alongside a short editorial praising the bravery of one woman standing against family exploitation. His employer, embarrassed by the publicity, suspended him indefinitely. Creditors, now aware he had no claim to my house, began calling him directly instead of me. For once, I was not the buffer absorbing his failures. The weight landed squarely on his shoulders. Rachel retreated first. I heard through neighbors that she packed her things and returned to her parents in Spokane. She was tired of cleaning up his mess, Mrs. Henderson said with a shrug. Without her, Daniel looked even smaller, no longer the smug son with a smirking wife at his side, but a man unraveling in plain sight. Legally, the consequences tightened quickly. With the lawyer's guidance, I filed formal fraud charges for the forged signatures. Detective Morrison confirmed an investigation was underway. "If he so much as tries to approach you again," he assured me, "we'll be ready." For years, Daniel had acted with impunity, believing my silence was permanent. Now, every step he took left a trace he couldn't erase. But the greatest shift wasn't in the town or in Daniel. It was in me. Each morning, I woke not with dread, but with purpose. Harvey and I moved from the motel into a small rental arranged through the church. It wasn't the house on Maple Street, but it was ours, quiet, safe, free of threats. At night, I no longer sat cataloging insults or anxieties. I organized memories, wrote in journals, even read aloud to Harvey, though he rarely followed the words. Sometimes he smiled faintly, and that was enough. The house itself would not remain in Daniel's reach. The transfer to the Veterans Housing Initiative went through cleanly, and I kept that secret until the papers were final. Daniel believed he was merely waiting me out. He didn't know the inheritance he coveted was already gone, redirected to families who would cherish it. In that decision, I felt a fierce joy, not spite, but justice. The aftermath wasn't without ache. Daniel was still my son, and some nights the thought of his downfall hollowed me out. But then I would remember his voice, obey or leave, and I knew the ache was just grief for the boy he had once been, not the man he had become. The truth had cost me, yes, but it had also freed me, and freedom, I realized, was worth everything. Winter crept into Kalispell with sharp winds and pale skies, but inside my little rental there was warmth. Harvey dozed in his chair, the radio humming softly beside him. For the first time in years, the silence in my home was not heavy with fear, but light with peace. Yet even in that peace, I knew the story wasn't finished. Daniel had disappeared from town, but the sheriff told me creditors were still circling, lawsuits stacking like snowdrifts. Someday he might return, desperate or bitter, and when he did, he would find a mother who was no longer afraid. I walked outside one evening, the stars brittle and bright above the mountains. For so long, I had been told I was weak, dependent, useful, but now I understood the truth. Strength isn't in silence or sacrifice. It's in refusing to be erased. As I locked the door behind me, a thought echoed in my chest. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a life rebuilt on my own terms. If your own child betrayed you like this, would you forgive or cut them off forever? Comment below. And if you followed me this far, remember the story continues. Subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you.